Last time we started talking about the extrinsic control systems within your kidneys. We mentioned that one of them is neural, which basically epinephrine and norepinephrine cause the constriction of your blood vessels, maintaining your blood pressure, and you also constrict the afferent arteriole to limit how much filtration is passing through your kidney, therefore limiting your urine production and maintaining your blood pressure. The more of the complex system that we discuss is the hormonal system, which is starting, just kind of reviewing this with you guys and try to answer the question as I ask them. So this whole system, which is a hormonal extrinsic control, it starts with the stimulation of your blood volume being low, which means your blood pressure is also low, which means your GFR is low and you're reabsorbing too much sodium. Now, your way your body or the component that recognizes these changes or your sensor slash integrator would be part of the nephron called juxtaglomerular complex, which starts to release its output called renin. Now, within your plasma of your blood, you have an inactive protein called angiotensinogen, which when interact with renin, it becomes cleaved and becomes angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 travels to your lungs and becomes angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 has 3 targets. One is your blood vessels. One is the hypothalamus, which is part of your central nervous system. And the third component is your adrenal gland that sits on top of your kidney, and it forces those glands to release a hormone called aldosterone. So we said one of the targets of the angiotensin is your blood vessel. So what is it going to do? The action is very similar to what epinephrine and norepinephrine will do. So it causes the vasoconstriction of the arterioles and the pericapillary sphincters. You guys remember? So you close the the sphincters that are located right here and right here. And that basically makes sure that the flow of blood is limited to the main blood vessels, and it helps maintain your blood pressure. You're also going to, it says afferent or efferent arteriole. You also vasoconstrict your afferent arteriole further to help limit your GFR. Please make the correction here. I'm just going to make it right now. This is going to be the afferent arteriole, not efferent. And part of its job, as I mentioned, angiotensin would be to target your thirst center, which is part of your hypothalamus or your central nervous system. So let's take a look at this. This is the thirst center response that we have. Just follow the arrows. It's pretty self-explanatory. So notice we have low blood volume, right? Blood pressure drops. Kids of the cell produce the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. Part of this system was angiotensin 2, which is going to target what? Your hypothalamus, more specifically the thirst center within the hypothalamus. And that's going to create a thirst sensation. Basically, it's going to force you to want water. Now, as soon as you start to drink water, the water is basically going to moisten your mouth, throats, and it's going to stretch your stomach and intestine as you drink water. Water is going to be absorbed into your gastrointestinal tract or your stomach and intestines. That means your blood osmolarity, which we haven't really talked about, so you can ignore that for now, but you have an increase in your plasma volume, which is what was your goal since you started with low plasma volume. So, angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction of the blood vessels to basically help you maintain your blood pressure. It triggers the hypothalamic thirst center, encouraging you to drink water to replace the lost water. And the last part is aldosterone that releases from the adrenal gland. Now, it's really, really interesting about how aldosterone works. Aldosterone is going to go back to your renal tubules, more specifically your distal convoluted tubules, and it's going to allow an increase in sodium reabsorption, and at the same time, it's going to excrete extra potassium. So aldosterone in your bloodstream or in renal tubules affect your DCT to increase reabsorption of sodium and excretion of potassium. Now, something you always need to remember this is a very important sentence, guys. Water always follows salt. H2O always follows what? Salt. So in this case, water is going to be following your sodium. So if there is an increase in sodium reabsorption, then there will be an increase in water reabsorption, which would also help you in terms of increasing your blood volume. Now, in this case, if you have aldosterone release being inhibited, which is it can be an example of a hormonal case or a hormonal deficiency that causes your body to remove a lot of the sodium, and that causes an excretion of significant amount of sodium, and in many cases a lot of water following that, and causing a decrease in blood volume. But that's not the case we're really going to focus on. Another reason that we can have aldosterone being released is if you have way too much potassium in your system. Remember that aldosterone is doing what? Is absorbing sodium and releasing and secreting potassium. So I don't necessarily need to have a lot of need for water to activate this system. I can have too much potassium in my system. And if I do have too much potassium, I'm going to have aldosterone in my bloodstream to force potassium into the urine or into the filtrate and eventually being removed from my body. And as a side effect, I'm going to start to intake sodium and water with that. This is a really, really nice picture, guys. It brings everything we have discussed in one place. So let's walk through this. So we have a scenario where you have a case of dehydration, you have sodium deficiency, or hemorrhage. So any of these cases would cause a drop in your blood pressure. You can also add potassium, high levels of potassium, that could also trigger this process. Now, as any of this scenario happens, there would be a decrease in blood volume, right? Decrease in blood volume means decrease in blood pressure. So you have angiotensin in your blood plasma, which is good for you guys to know that it's produced by liver, like all the other blood proteins. And when there is a decrease in blood pressure, your juxtaglomerular structure in the kidney starts to produce what? Renin. Renin interacts with angiotensinogen, which is the inactive version, and that becomes angiotensin 1. I said angiotensin 1 goes to your lungs and gets broken down using angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 has 3 targets, right? There's only 2 of them that are listed here. You have the vasoconstriction of the arteriole, which we already talked about, which helps you maintain your blood pressure. You can see it maintaining your blood pressure right here. You can target the adrenal cortex to produce what? Aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to do what? Increase sodium and water reabsorption, and that causes a secretion increase in potassium. You also have hydrogen, but I usually don't talk about the hydrogen, so you really don't need to focus on that. But remember, if you're absorbing sodium and water, that increases your blood volume. An increased blood volume causes an increase in your blood pressure. As I mentioned, the only thing that is missing here, angiotensin has a third target, which is your hypothalamus. Sorry about the handwriting. And it's basically activating your thirst center and forcing your body to drink if that option is available for it. Here is the same scenario. We have two cases where your adrenal cortex is going to start to produce aldosterone. One of the options, as I said, is a high concentration of potassium, and the other options are basically low sodium, dehydration, drop in blood pressure, etc. Both target adrenal cortex, which forces to produce aldosterone. Targeting kidney tubules causes an increase in sodium reabsorption and increased potassium secretion, and you're maintaining your homeostasis back by retaking sodium and water and excreting your excretion of your potassium. Do remember the system that I described up here for you, aldosterone, renin, angiotensin. Renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system is typically represented as RAS, or ROS, as however you want to say it. So if I ask you about this system, RAAS, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. That's what it's discussing. Now, the next component that we have is regulation of urine concentration. One thing that you guys need to remember is as you started to go down the descending limb, you were only reabsorbing water, and as you start to come up, you were reabsorbing salt only. So that means as you get to the bottom part of this loop, you have lost a significant amount of water, but not of the solutes. So down here, you have the most concentrated filtrate. That's one topic to remember, filtrate. Most concentrated filtrate is at the bottom of your nephron loop. Now understand this. As you start to, let's start from here. So as you start to move salt out into the interstitial fluid, the osmolarity in this space becomes high, right? Not inside the renal tubules, but the osmolarity on the top becomes high, right? So the environment, which is your IF, here is all of this IF. As you push more salt out, the environment on the top region becomes what? Really concentrated with solute. That goes, remember osmotic pressure, the concept of osmotic pressure? The more solutes I have here, right? Like sodium outside, what is water going to do? Water is going to follow much easier out, going toward the salt. So water is going to leave the descending limb. No salt or none of the sodium, potassium is going to leave. So only and only. So as you're reabsorbing more salt, think about this. As you're reabsorbing more water, then the osmolarity in here in the IF goes down. But the osmolarity in the filtrate is going to go up. Osmolarity in the filtrate is going to go up. As we said in the loop, it's going to be the highest. So you start to come up through the ascending limb, right? And the only thing you can diffuse out would be your salts. You have a lot of concentration of solute inside the tube. So what are they going to do? easily move into your IF because their concentration is high. So it moves from high, which is your 2, toward the low, which is your IF. Again, as you start to go up, the concentration of solutes in your IF has gone up, which means water in a descending limb is going to follow it. Then you leave the water, you take away the water, so solute becomes concentrated, then solute leave on this side, and this cycle continuously happen to allow to basically reabsorb as much material as you require from your descending and ascending limb. I'm not really going to go into this. This is just a highlight of the same concept I discussed with you. This is a juxtamedullary nephron, which is really important for formation of concentrated urine. A couple of numbers I just want you guys to notice is as you start on the top, the filtrate is relatively dilute. But as you start to go down, the filtrate is becoming more and more concentrated. But by the time you reach the nephron loop, you have reached a 1200 milliosmolarity concentration. And again, as you start to go up, you are removing your salt, right? Which means that the solute concentration would become very low. By the time typically it reaches your DCT, it's about 100 milliosmolarity. This is present in your juxtamedullary nephron because they have such a long loop, which enables them to basically absorb a significant amount of solutes and water as it goes through the descending and the ascending limb. I'm going to finish this PowerPoint by going over the antidiuretic hormones. Antidiuretic hormone, as the name implies, is a hormone that is going to be activated when your body needs to hold on to the water. Antidiuretic means against diuretic, right? Diuretic means loss of water. Antidiuretic means basically preventing water loss. So antidiuretic is going to be released when you have way too much solute in your bloodstream, but not enough water. So you have too much solute, high osmolarity in your bloodstream, but not enough water. So what you want to do is you want to prevent your body from losing more water in your urine. So let's look at the same system we discussed, very similar to the pathway of stimulus, sensor integrator, output, etc. So antidiuretic hormone is going to be stimulated, or the system is going to be stimulated when your blood osmolarity is too high, which means you have way too much solutes in your blood, but not enough water. So an example of it would be basically you are dehydrated. Now, the posterior pituitary gland, which is a tiny gland inside the brain, right underneath the hypothalamus, is going to start to secrete antidiuretic hormone, which is also known as vasopressin. Vasopressin has the target within your nephron, more specifically its distal convoluted tubules as well as the collecting duct. Now, if you guys remember, we talked about aquaporins. So aquaporins are basically proteins that allow the water to be reabsorbed. So, or water to be moved, if that would be a better way of saying it. So aquaporins are going to allow the water channels, or ADH is going to allow the aquaporins to be inserted in your DCT and the collecting duct. And the more aquaporins you have, the more water is going to be reabsorbed from your filtrate, and therefore you're going to increase your blood volume and therefore decrease your osmolarity. Remember and understand that when you take too much water from your filtrate, your urine concentration is going to go up and the urine volume is going to go down, because you're taking the water out of it, but we're keeping the solute in there. So urine becomes concentrated and the volume of urine becomes small. Let's show you this picture. I really like these pictures right next to each other to give you an idea of how when you're overhydrated versus dehydrated influences the ADH. So let's just start with the one on the left hand side, which is a scenario of overhydration. You just drink normal amount of water or drank too much water. In that scenario, your body will not release ADH from the posterior pituitary gland. That means that there is no aquaporin that is going to be placed in the DCT and the collecting duct, right? So no ADH is going to be released from the posterior pituitary gland. Number of aquaporins in the collecting duct as well as the DCT is going to start to decrease. So water reabsorption is going to go down, and that means your urine is going to be what? Dilute, very important, and high volume. Dilute and high volume. In an opposite scenario, when you are dehydrated, your body wants to hold on to as much as water as it can. So if you are dehydrated, that means your osmolarity in the blood is too high because you don't have enough water. Your posterior pituitary gland is going to produce high levels of ADH. ADH is going to put more aquaporins in the DCT and the collecting duct. And that means that you're going to reabsorb water at a much higher rate. So notice that you start with about 100, but by the time you get to the bottom of the collecting duct, your concentration is about 1200. So this means you take in way too much water out of the urine or out of the filtrate. So notice what it says. There is a small volume of urine, but it's going to be super concentrated. Notice the numbers. 100 milliosmolarity versus 1200 milliosmolarity. So concentrated means low volume. Diluted means high volume. Okay, I'm going to stop here and then we'll continue in the next presentation.